He moved in and out of the shadows, hiding his intentions amid the darkness of the night. And then, the eyes, they were peering into the kitchen window, watching their prey. She was a beautiful, voluptuous brunette. He had watched her before. Danny, take off your socks and put them on your hands. Danny, mask your identity. Danny, now unlatch the door. She'll be sorry.
Welcome to SKB, Dissecting the Serial Killer's Brain. I'm your host, Caroline, a university biology professor and true crime junkie. Thanks for joining me on my quest to understand evil. This is episode 3 of a 5-part series, Danny Rawling, the Killer Cowboy Crooner. We left Danny in 1977, right after his wife, Ametha, had left him and taken their 3.5-year-old daughter, Kylie, away. Once Danny realized that Ametha was not coming back, he started to let the darkness envelop him, and he began to peep again. There seems to be some connection between voyeurism and anxiety. In fact, anxiety is one of the most common comorbid conditions of voyeuristic disorder. In the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it's the 5th edition, voyeuristic disorder brings sexual gratification on seeing other people perform private activities such as undressing, being naked, and or seeing people performing a sexual act. Voyeurism becomes voyeuristic disorder when the urge to engage in voyeuristic activities becomes so strong that the individual is not able to control their impulses. According to Michael Levan in Sexual Deviance Theory, Assessment, and Treatment, voyeurism typically occurs because of 3 factors. One is hypercathexis, which is preoccupation with visual function. Postnatal experiences that involve visual exchanges with mother, and early trauma that cripples the mother-child relationship. There's something like 8 characteristics that are common among serial killers. These include child abuse, verbal, physical, and or sexual, neglect and or isolation, voyeurism, an inability to feel empathy, animal abuse, pyromania, a predisposition towards addiction, as well as head trauma. A boy's relationship with mom seems to be the most important factor in creating a serial killer. It seems like if mother is totally absent because of a drug or an alcohol problem or some other kind of mental illness or mental disorder, or if mom is an overbearing, smothering type of caregiver, like in the case of Ed Kemper. If you're interested in learning more about Ed Kemper, my first series was Ed Kemper, a Real Motherfucker. So go back and listen to that if you want to hear more about who Ed Kemper was. But let's get back to Danny Rawling. Once Danny and Ametha had separated, Danny started to date a girl that he met at a church, I think, at the Church of the Nazarene, which wasn't his church, but it was another local church. She was a 17-year-old named Mary Lynn. But when her parents found out that Danny had been married and that he actually had a child already, she wasn't allowed to see him again. Danny would commit his first rape, according to him anyway, in 1977. He says that he went out the night after he was served divorce papers, and he went to the house of a couple of college girls that he had peeped on before. One of those girls was a voluptuous brunette, and she was home the night that Danny went peeping. In Danny's book, The Making of a Serial Killer, the real story of the Gainesville murders, he always refers to himself as another person. Danny claims that the rape was over very quickly and that the next day he felt incredibly ashamed about what he had done. And so he decided to go over and apologize to the woman for raping her, which I don't even know what to say to that, because can you imagine having been raped the night before and then your rapist comes to the door to apologize to you? I'm sorry, but I don't think that would really make things any better for me. He says as he turned down the young lady's street, he saw a guy about his age coming at him, and he thought it might have been the woman's brother or her boyfriend or something, and so he chickened out and ran away. So I've been trying to figure out for a long time now, not a long time since I started this podcast, what is the percentage of voyeurs that go on to commit rape? I've always thought that it would be a pretty easy leap to go from that sort of voyeurism, and I'm not talking about voyeurism like watching, pornography made by adults or, whatever, but when it's without the person being watched without their knowledge or consent is when, it's a huge problem. But so I've always wondered what percentage of voyeurs go on to commit rape, or if they just outgrow the voyeurism. And there's not a lot of information out there on it, on the link between the two. My guess is that voyeurs who haven't been caught aren't going to come forward to report having been a voyeur. I think we can all accept that rape is not necessarily a crime of sex, but it's a crime of control, right? So what happened in the childhood of a rapist that drove them to become a rapist, right? Well, according to Gannon and Ward in Sexual Deviance, Theory, Assessment, and Treatment, authors indicated that rapists reported having adversarial relationships with their fathers. Many of the rapists that were studied in this particular study, they also had childhood parental attachment disorders. The authors go on to talk about a Swedish study in which 535 rapists were questioned, and of those, about 13% reported having had problems with drugs or alcohol. There was also an increased incidence of traumatic brain injuries in the convicted rapists that were included in this study. It was about this time when Danny also began to commit robberies. He now thought of himself as an outlaw.
A man named Jesse chose a life of crime. Stood on the wall by his homemade sign.
Danny's troubles continued. One night, he was on his way to pick up a girl for a date. I guess she lived in a trailer, off of a country back road, and he had trouble finding her place, got lost, and he says that he saw a UFO that night. So according to Danny in his book, The Making of a Serial Killer, he says that he'd gotten lost trying to find her street, and he stopped on a dirt road to kind of regroup, and he was sitting there with his car turned on, the headlights on, the radio on, and as he was sitting there, the headlights and radio started to flicker and his car stalled. It took him a minute to get the car to start back up again. And as he turned around to leave, he saw lights. So he went back to investigate, and he saw this, what he described as a glowing, pulsing, blue-white object that had this like rainbow kind of ring around it that was kind of dancing around the outside of it. Once he finally got out of there, and he got out of there fast, he found a payphone at a bar, called his date, got directions, and after they'd had a couple of drinks, he started to tell her that he thought he saw a UFO. And she said that when she and her son had been in the car earlier, they were listening to the radio, and that people had called the station to report that they had also seen a UFO around that time. And I tried to look up UFO sightings or reports outside of Shreveport, Louisiana that year, but I was not able to find anything. Danny loved to skate, and so one night he went roller skating at the local roller rink in Shreveport, and there were a bunch of teenage kids there, young teenage kids, that had a bunch of these glow stick bracelet things that you snap them and then they glow in the dark, and they were playing some kind of game with them, throwing them at each other. It was some kind of flirting game. Yeah, Danny, a little girl had thrown one, and Danny went and picked it up and skated over to her and gave it to her. And apparently the girl's little boyfriend got very angry, so he skated over to Danny and proceeded to punch Danny in the testicles. If that story is true, I wonder if that teenage boy ever realized who it was that he punched in the testicles. Danny ended up having to have an operation for the injury, and the injury is called a varicocele. And what that is, there's a group of veins that surround the spermatic cord, and the somatic cord in each testicle, and that group of veins, they're called like the pampiniform plexus, right? So they're almost like, it's like a network of veins that don't have arteries directly connected to them through capillary beds. Basically, a varicocele is like a varicose vein that you get in your leg, just in the testicles. It was in 1979 that Danny's crimes began to escalate. According to Danny, it was when he lost his job in Shreveport in 1979 that his crimes began to escalate. Danny was quickly the prime suspect in an attempted robbery of a 7-Eleven on May 12th, 1979. When Danny found out there was only $11 in the drawer, he handed it back to the cashier and then he left. The next day, on May 13th, 1979, he robbed a liquor store and bar called Charlie's Lounge, and this apparently almost got him killed. It was 11 p.m. Danny went into Charlie's Lounge and he yelled, "This is a holdup, everybody on the floor." But at first, nobody heard him. Eventually, he was able to get everybody's attention and get people to get down to the floor, and he got some money out of the cash register. But as he was running from the scene, someone from the bar had started shooting at him, but unfortunately he didn't get shot and was able to escape. On May 15th, he robbed the L&R liquor store. After this, Danny hitchhiked from Shreveport, Louisiana towards Alabama. And he ended up at his Aunt Jeanette's place in Phoenix City, Alabama. According to Mary Rizik in her book, The Gainesville Ripper, on May 25th, 1979, Danny was at his Aunt Jeanette's place in Phoenix City, Alabama. It was his birthday, or was near his birthday, and he wanted his aunt to go out and party with him to celebrate his birthday. She didn't want to go out, so he asked her, if he could borrow her car to go out, and she said no. Of course, Danny took this as a personal slight, and he decided to walk into town, and as he walked, his fury grew. Once he got into town, into Phoenix City, he stole a car, and then he drove to Montgomery, Alabama, and proceeded to rob a Winn-Dixie. And then on May 31st, 1979, Danny hitchhiked from Montgomery, Alabama to Columbus, Georgia, and he robbed another Winn-Dixie. He had a thing for robbing Winn-Dixies, apparently. And if you don't know what Winn-Dixie is, it's just a grocery store, chain of grocery stores in the southeast. He ran into the woods to hide, but he was caught about 30 minutes later. Once he was caught and in custody of the police, he confessed to the robberies in Shreveport, Montgomery, and the one in Columbus as well. On July 31st, 1979, Danny pled guilty to 2 counts of robbery for the holdup of the Winn-Dixie in Columbus, Georgia. He received 2 concurrent 6-year sentences for that holdup of the Winn-Dixie in Columbus, Georgia. Just a few weeks after sentencing, Danny was sent to the Medical Classification Center in Jackson, Georgia. He was there for about 16 days, and then he was sent to Reidsville to complete his 6-year sentence. His mother, Claudia, said that while he was at Reidsville, he was able to call her regularly and write letters. Claudia would much later state that she felt like Danny had never matured beyond the age of 15, which actually kind of makes sense because we know the brain doesn't fully develop until at least age 25. Specifically, the area of the brain that is not fully developed until then is the frontal lobe of the brain, and that's the area that is responsible for critical thinking, impulse control, higher level thought that you don't see in teenage boys, right? If Danny started drinking heavily at age 15 or 16, then that would no doubt stunt his brain development to some degree at least, and so he may have only had the mental maturity of a teenager. I found it really interesting, the control that his father James had over his mother Claudia. Claudia was not sure if she was going to be able, if James was going to allow her to go visit Danny while he was in prison. Reedsville is a prison that is in the Georgia State Prison System. According to Danny, while he was at Reedsville, he was jumped in the shower once, and again, according to Danny, he almost killed his attacker. There was a lot of racial tension in the prison, which I don't think is surprising to anybody. I think that's typical in just about any prison in this country, even today. After he fought off his would-be attacker, he said that no one bothered him again. And just in case you didn't think Danny Rawling was a disgusting human being already, he would also refer to the black guys in prison as dog or monkeys. So, yeah, super, super awesome guy. There were feral cats that were living under the prison. According to Danny, he attempted to kill one of these cats. He threw a rock at it while he was hanging from a 9-foot fence. So that was Danny hanging from a 9-foot fence, like hanging on the fence and pulling himself up and throwing a rock at the cat. Danny doesn't say that he killed the cat. He says he knocked it out. But according to Ryzek in her book, The Gainesville Ripper, she says that he actually did stone the cat to death. Danny was quite the escape artist. He liked to break out of prison, and he would do this a number of times over the years. But once while he was on a work detail on October 8th, 1979, so he hadn't even been at Reedsville for that long. He was on a road gang doing a work detail, and he just walked away from the road gang. He was recaptured shortly after that, and they added a year to his sentence. While he was in prison, he was known as Cowboy. In February of 1980, Danny pled guilty to the July 1979 armed robbery of Winn-Dixie in Alabama, and for that he was sentenced to 10 years. After Danny had spent about 6 months at Reedsville, he was sent to Alabama to stand trial for charges for a holdup in Montgomery. During his time here in Alabama, his lawyer had him sent to Bryce Mental Institution to be evaluated. Here, Danny was given the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Index, or the MMPI, and the Thematic Apperception Test, which is the TAT. So the MMPI measures for personality disorders, psychopathy, those sorts of things. The Thematic Apperception Test is used to ascertain attitudes and feelings. The findings of the MMPI and the TAT were that Danny craves power, he exhibits deep self-pity, he persists in blaming others for his troubles, he has a poor self-image, he had marked inferiority complex, complex violent impulses, deeply ambivalent feelings for his mother, a violent love-hate relationship with his father, whom he idolizes and wanted to impress. While in Bryce, Danny staged a diversion so that he could once again try to escape. Somehow Danny was able to convince one of the other inmate patients to pretend to choke, and then when the orderlies would go running to help him, Danny grabbed one of the orderlies and put him in a chokehold. The inmate patients that were supposed to assist Danny with his escape plan really didn't do their part. But Danny had this orderly in a chokehold, and the orderly then pretended to pass out. And as Danny lowered that orderly to the ground, the orderly then grabbed Danny by his testicles, and he did a hip toss. And it turned out that orderly had a black belt in Taekwondo. This actually landed Danny in the hole for a few weeks. And it also left him with a permanent tear in his right epididymis. And the epididymis is, it's kind of like, so that you've got the testes that are found within the scrotum, right? And the testes inside of them are where sperm production happens. And so as that sperm leaves the testicle, it moves through a system of tubules to this structure that kind of wraps itself around part of the testes called the epididymis. And the epididymis, I like to think of it as the testicles, like the testes mullet, right? So if you can picture what that looks like. So the epididymis then, he had a permanent tear in it, which is, the guy must have had a pretty good hold on Danny's testes to do that. So other than his juvenile experience in the hole, this is Danny's first real long-term experience in solitary confinement. He described it as a place where your thoughts become so loud you can hear yourself think. There's a lot of studies that have shown that isolation can cause damage to the structure and function of the brain, the result of which can manifest as aggression to the unfamiliar, persistent fear, and hypersensitivity to threatening stimuli. So it'd be like permanent PTSD. In the 1950s, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, Dr. Harry Harlow, conducted a study using rhesus macaques. And rhesus macaques they're super, super social animals. If you just go to Google and Google image search rhesus macaques, you'll see them like all piled together. So within a couple of days, the rhesus macaques that had been put in isolation, after just a couple days of that, they had seemingly given up, and they would like sit in this hunched position. And after they were removed from isolation, the rhesus macaques would stare blankly and rock in place for long periods of time, circling their cages repetitively and even mutilating themselves. The monkeys that were isolated for 12 months never recovered. In another study in the 1950s, this study employed graduate students who were to spend 6 weeks in sensory deprivation, but none of them made it any longer than 7 days. As a result of the study, at least for some period of time afterwards, nearly every student lost the ability to think clearly about anything for any length of time. Some students suffered from hallucinations. One man could see nothing but dogs, another nothing but eyeglasses. Harvard Medical School did a study where they interviewed inmates in solitary confinement and found that about a third of them were actively psychotic or acutely suicidal. The author of that study has since concluded that solitary confinement can cause a specific psychiatric syndrome characterized by hallucinations, panic attacks, overt paranoia, diminished impulse control, hypersensitivity to external stimuli, difficulties with thinking, concentration, and memory. Some inmates even lose the ability to maintain a state of alertness, while others develop crippling obsessions. I think probably one of the most disturbing things about solitary confinement is that mentally ill individuals are allowed to be put into solitary confinement. And in fact, a fifth to 2/3 of prisoners in solitary confinement are believed to have had some sort of mental illness before being put in the hole. And according to the American Civil Liberties Union, solitary confinement can lead to hypersensitivity to external stimuli, perceptual distortions and hallucinations, increased anxiety and nervousness, revenge fantasies, rage and irrational anger, fears of persecution, lack of impulse control, claustrophobia, severe and chronic depression, appetite loss and weight loss, heart palpitations, withdrawal, blunting of affect and apathy, talking to oneself, headaches, problems sleeping, confusing thought processes, nightmares, dizziness, self-mutilation, and lower levels of brain function, including a decline in overall EEG activity. And an EEG is an electroencephalogram, and basically it measures the activity in different states of your brain, when your brain's in different states. Now, I'm not excusing anything that Danny did or goes on to do. However, you have to wonder if solitary confinement served to exacerbate Danny's already present mental illnesses. According to Danny, his cell did not have a toilet, so he had to urinate and defecate in a corner and use newspaper to cover it. I hope that that's not true, but, who knows. One of the other stories that Danny talked about in his book was that in the middle of the night, he'd gone to go urinate, and he walked in, and this is, if you get grossed out by things, just fast forward a couple seconds. He walked in on a man squatting on the toilet. This man had his own hand up his anus and was pulling out his own intestines. I cannot even imagine seeing something like that. Another inmate threatened to beat Danny because Danny did not give the man his grape jelly. This guy was about to attack Danny, and according to Danny, he was able to land 3 punches to protect himself against this deranged man, but he ended up in the hole again. Well, on June 7th, 1982, after serving 3 years in Georgia, he was sent to Alabama to start serving his 10-year sentence. While he was in prison in Alabama, he did well, apparently. He would sing for the other prisoners. He worked in the prison bakery, where he earned a reputation for his yeast rolls. And he earned a 1-day furlough. In July, he escaped from a work camp. and he went to hide in the woods, but was captured after just 2 days. Danny sure liked to try to break out of places, didn't he? On June 7th, 1984, 2 years after he was sent to Alabama, Danny was released from the Alabama prison, and he went back to Shreveport. He stayed with his parents, but his mother wasn't allowed to cook for him or do his laundry because James wouldn't allow it. I would imagine this was not an ideal situation for anyone. So Danny eventually moved out and got a little apartment. His Aunt Agnes gave him a bed and some furniture. Danny would get jobs and then he'd lose them. He would occasionally go to work for his aunt at her craft shop. But as soon as an employer would find out that he was a convicted felon, they would let him go. So we assume that Danny got his life together and went on the straight and narrow, right? Well, of course not. He would later write that he had broken into so many houses and homes he could not remember them all, and that he would break in for a lot of different reasons. Could be sex, thrills, power, need, desperation, or shelter, but the main reason was the thrill of violating someone else's sanctum. Danny described one break-in where it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and he broke into this house, but it was occupied by a family of 3. He said the husband was asleep in the guest room, and the mother and the child were asleep in the master bedroom. Danny took the man's wallet out of the man's pants that were hung over a chair. Then he went into the woman's room and he watched her sleep. Danny had come into the house and he had a buck knife with him, but he didn't hurt anyone. He stole about $75, but it was really the thrill that did it for him. So Danny sneaking into houses or breaking into houses and watching people sleep is voyeurism that's escalated. So let's revisit voyeurism again, because I think this is really important. There is a guy named Dr. John Money who worked at Johns Hopkins University in the 60s, 70s, and I think even into the 80s and 90s. Dr. Money, he put forth this idea that we all have a love map, and this love map is a developmental representation or template in the mind and in the brain depicting the idealized lover and idealized program of sexuo-erotic activity projected in imagery or actually engaged in with that lover. Michael Laban, in Sexual Deviance Theory, Assessment, and Treatment, he took this idea of a love map and he elaborated on it. He said that a typical voyeur's love map can be described as, quote, objects include unsuspecting young naked women or young women in the process of disrobing. His preferred activities include hunting for these women and, when he finds one, observing her, perhaps while masturbating. Alternatively, he may not masturbate at that time, but may later draw from a treasure trove of successful hunts to provide him with fantasies that he relies on while masturbating. His objects and activities may or may not be positively balanced. If peeping has a positive balance for him, he probably either is unreflective about what he does or tells himself a story that assigns his victims responsibility for guarding their privacy while naked. Okay. If peeping usually has a negative balance for him, he may well have cycles. That is, when the voyeur satisfies his drive to reduce anxiety, he may find himself experiencing shame as a sequel, end quote. So basically what this is saying is that there's some sort of disturbance in the love map, and a voyeur's love map is based on unsuspecting victims. And I think this probably would be a very good description for Danny. According to Freud, voyeurism results from early trauma during the first or second year of life that cripples the relationship of the mother and child. Such trauma is thought to result in pre-genital fixation, sexual identity problems, and impairment of both ego and superego. By contrast, simple scoptophilia, which is the obtaining of sexual pleasure by looking at naked bodies, erotic photographs, etc., as a substitute for an actual sexual relationship, is suspected of involving less serious or later traumas. According to Freud, not Freud, but Freud, voyeurism is a disorder of courtship phases. So the courtship phases are finding, affiliative, tactile, and copulatory phases. So basically, finding phase would be like going out and looking for someone that you are interested in. The affiliative phase is non-touching, flirting, conversation, those sorts of things. The tactile phase would be touching, kissing, petting, whatever. And then copulatory, obviously, is sex. So Freud says that voyeurism is distortion of finding. Whereas like exhibition is distortion of the affiliative phase and frauderism is distortion of tactile phase. Rape is a distortion of the copulatory phase. Freund reported that 20% of voyeurs he studied had also committed sexual assaults or rapes. This percentage changes somewhat depending upon the study you look at. After his unsuccessful attempt to go back home to Shreveport, Danny left Shreveport and he ended up in Havana, Florida. Havana, Florida is just north of Tallahassee. He went there to stay with his Uncle Eric and his Aunt Nadine. At first, they welcomed Danny with open arms. And this was until they found marijuana in his room and asked him to leave. The next rape that Danny wrote about happened in November of 1984 in Savannah, Georgia. Now, throughout his telling of the story, he referred to himself as the Eyes or the outlaw Enad, which is Danny spelled backwards. So the story goes like this. Danny had been peeping on a woman named Lisa around 2:30 in the morning, and she had just finished cleaning her house and had undressed and gotten into the bathtub. Danny tried the back door to her house, but it was locked, so he then went to the door in the carport, and that door opened. He waited in the hallway for her to emerge. He had his buck knife at the ready for her to come out. She opened the door, and she was terrified to see him standing there, see a masked, leather-gloved intruder. Danny attempted to rape her. He made her perform oral sex on him, but then felt bad because she was so sweet and innocent. According to Danny, right, so who knows how true this is? I don't think it is. According to Danny, he decided not to rape her, and he took his mask off. He then claims that Lisa told him he was handsome and asked him why he would try to rape someone. And then, she decided to make him scrambled eggs and they ate breakfast together, right? Because that's what you do with the man that just about rapes you, is tell him he's handsome and make him scrambled eggs. She asked his name, and he told her it was Danny Rawling and that he was a singer-songwriter. She wanted him to play something for her, so he did, and she recorded him singing It's a Gray Way.
Morning break. Crusty eyes awake. Dreams she cleans like rose ghost haunting the glow the wind blew. It's a great way without you. It's a great way without you. Princess Angel, never forget. Perfume and a gentle touch, she casts a spell. Crystal blue pools, cameo glare.
Then following Danny's serenade of Lisa, he claimed that the two had consensual sex, but that she protested when they went into the bedroom, and then Danny stole her virginity. So that doesn't really make sense. He says it was consensual, but that she protested, and he took her virginity when he raped her. She drove him home, and Danny was afraid that she was going to call the police, so he took off. Danny hitchhiked across the country, and he ended up in California. So by January 15th, 1985, he made it to California to visit his Uncle Joe, his Aunt Mira, and his cousin Donald. Donald would later describe Danny as a loner with a drinking problem. Danny stayed with them for about 3 months, and his Aunt Mira loaned him money to buy a motorcycle, but he wrecked it not long after that on February 13th, 1985, and he was treated for a concussion. Based on the childhood abuse that Danny and Kevin, his brother, suffered through, it is unlikely that this motorcycle accident was the first concussion that Danny had ever received. And we know that chronic traumatic encephalopathy is the result of concussions over and over and over again, and it can lead to aggressive and violent behavior. In July of, now the dates on this vary, because according to Reisach in her book, The Gainesville Ripper, it was July of 1985, but according to Danny, it was July of 1986. He was hitchhiking through Jackson, Mississippi, and he ended up in a vehicle with a man who he found out later was wanted because the guys got pulled over and the man was arrested. As the man was getting out of the car, he gave Danny his .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun to hold. Danny took that gun and he hopped a bus to Clinton, Mississippi. On July 22nd in 1985, when he got to Clinton, Mississippi, he went to a Kroger, which is another kind of grocery store, and he robbed it for $290. He then broke into a house and he took stuff. He ate a yogurt and a banana, and he left the remnants of his snack out in the open on the counter so the occupants would know he had been there. He stole a car from the house but was pulled over for driving erratically, and he was then promptly arrested when police saw that there was a ski mask sitting on the passenger seat. When Danny was arrested, he was provided with a public defender, and the public defender's name was Arthur Carlisle. Arthur Carlisle would bring Danny candy bars, and he later said that it seemed like Danny just needed somebody, or was just looking for someone to listen to him. Danny pled guilty to armed robbery, and he received a 4-year sentence, of which he served 3, according to Danny. But according to Reisach, he was sentenced to 15 years, so I'm not really sure which one it is. While he was in prison this time, he shaved his head and his eyebrows, and he would beat his head against the concrete wall until it was bloody. He even asked one time to have his arms cut off so that he couldn't do bad things anymore. But instead, on April 15th, 1986, Danny escaped from this Mississippi prison. He made his way eventually to El Paso, Texas, and El Paso is right on, you can, like when you're driving through El Paso, you can just look, like, you know, what direction you're going. If you're going west, you can just look to your left in some parts of the town, and you can actually see Mexico there. But so Danny joined up with a Mexican man that he met while he was wandering the deserts of El Paso. The two of them didn't speak the same language, but Danny played a bit of a song called Mystery Rider to his new friend that he called Desert Rat. Danny followed Desert Rat into Mexico, and they ended up at Desert Rat's family's place, and Danny joined them for beer, and he sang for them.
Black stallion, you bring a grin. Dressed in snake hide, warm black leather. Mystery rider, what's your name? You're a killer, driven gone insane.
Danny was picked up by a couple of state troopers in El Paso, and he spent 6 days in an El Paso jail before he was sent back to Mississippi. Danny didn't get tried for this escape. Instead, he was given the choice to serve an additional 8-year sentence or to go to solitary confinement for 240 days. Danny chose solitary confinement. 240 days in solitary confinement. Unbelievable. So while he was in solitary confinement, Danny was visited by another demon. He said he woke up to see this slimy thing jump out of the shadows and onto his chest. It had a hideous grin and red eyes and scaly claws, which it used to pry Danny's mouth open, and it shoved its tongue down his throat. So again, I think I mentioned earlier that it sounds like Danny had sleep paralysis. That demon kind of creature and the compression of the chest is like standard textbook sleep paralysis stuff. Danny would later write that all of his jail cells while he was in Mississippi, they were awful and dirty. He says he was pushed beyond his ability to cope, and this is when Enad and Gemini appeared. Enad, or Danny spelled backwards, was that part of Danny that was strong, self-willed, courageous, bold, and daring, but Enad had a conscience. Gemini was described, or Danny described Gemini as the darkest night, evil, destructive, powerful, demon, grim reaper, murderer, bloodthirsty, psychotic. He came from all of the pain, everything sick and insane that had happened. Danny's time in solitary confinement definitely had a huge impact on his psyche and how he dealt with things. Once Danny got out of solitary confinement, he was assigned to a chain gang that worked out in the cotton fields. And apparently, all these stories are from Danny out of his book, so who knows what's true. But I guess they were out picking cotton one day, and Danny went to go squat underneath the water cooler to drink some water out of that, and somebody kept throwing water in his face. So when he figured out who it was, and of course it was the biggest, meanest convict, in the chain gang, when he figured out who it was, he attacked the guy anyway. And because this little whitey boy, they called him, stood up to this giant black guy convict, they started calling him Psycho. Danny was finally released from prison out on parole on July 29th, 1988. So he was placed on probation for 5 years, and he had to complete that probation from Shreveport. So, of course, he ended up living with his parents. One night, shortly after Danny had been paroled and he was staying with his parents, James and Claudia, invited over a friend of James, or a woman that James had met recently, who was a country music singer, country western singer. Her name was Bunny Mills. It was 1988. Bunny Mills was 58 years old, and Danny was 34 years old. Bunny goes over to the Rawlings house to have dinner, not knowing that their son Danny was going to be there. She comes in the house and rounds a corner, and as she goes around the corner, she sees this good-looking guy. And as Danny sees Bunny, he says, "Oh my goodness, she's a beautiful woman. I think I'm going to lose my heart." And Bunny went over to him and told him that she would take good care of his heart. After dinner, James and Claudia asked Bunny if she would get her guitar and play. And so she agreed to do that and came out into the living room and she started to play her guitar.
I never will forget the day I first heard him sing. Listening to the radio, keeping time with the front porch swing. I was just a kid back then, this old guitar was new. I'd play along when he sang his song, the man who on the blues. On stage at the Grand Ole Opry, 1,000,000 hearts were won. From Tennessee and around the world, the bells would live on. So many have since come and gone, but no one can fill his shoes. There'll never be another like the man who on the blues. I'd like to have been there when Hank sang your cheap heart. I'm so lonesome I could cry, Lord tears me apart. Thank you, Hank, for I saw the light. a lot to you. I'd like to shake the hand of the man who's on the blues.
Bunny and Danny started dating after that, and they would have an on-again, off-again relationship for a number of years. Bunny would take Danny to dinner, to movies, she'd buy him clothes, buy him jewelry, take him on trips with her. And of course, Danny enjoyed that. But he found himself quickly using her. And he would go to her house to complain about his parents and confide in her. Anytime he was really depressed, he would go to Bunny. Bunny tried over and over again to try to get him to go to counseling and get help for everything that was going on. But he just wouldn't do it. If you remember back to episode 1, Danny's childhood, Danny had a dog that his father had found when he was out patrolling one night and brought the dog home for the boys. But Danny actually watched his father kick that dog to death. So it stands to reason then that Danny would go get a puppy and bring it to live with him and his parents, and then expect his father to treat that dog any better than he treated his own children, let alone Danny's dog when Danny was a young kid. Well, when Danny came home from work one night, he found his dad kicking the puppy, so he gave the dog away. Danny would get several jobs in restaurants. He got a job at the Western Sizzler, and after work or on his breaks, he would go to the mall where the Western Sizzler was and wander around in Dillard's. And one day when he was in Dillard's, he spotted a pretty young woman named Julie Grissom. It turned out that the two had gone to church together when he still attended the King's Temple, but now she must have been a teenager then. Now she was 23 and he was 35. After Danny was fired from the Western Sizzler, he got a job at a Mexican restaurant, and there he met a woman that he liked named Diane Mays. He wanted to pursue a relationship with her, but she wasn't interested, so they were just friends. And once Diane found out that Danny was a convicted felon, their friendship ended as well, and Danny was really upset and angry about this. There was a period of time when Danny missed a few days of work without calling, and according to the manager at the time of this Mexican restaurant, he fired Danny on November 4th, 1989. Now, according to Danny, Danny was fired not because he missed a few days of work without calling, but instead because the manager was jealous that Danny was dating all of the waitresses. When Danny was fired, he threatened to kill the manager and the cook. And after he lost his job at the Mexican restaurant, Danny was now convinced that nothing would ever work out for him. And he says it was at this point that he no longer tried to keep his demon at bay. On November 6, 1989, the bodies of a woman named Julie Grissom, her father Tom Grissom, and her 8-year-old nephew Sean were discovered. The medical examiner put the time of death for Julie, Tom, and Sean as about 2 days earlier on November 4th. Julie was bound with duct tape. She was raped and stabbed to death with a Marine K-bar knife. She had bite marks and saliva on her breasts, but her vaginal area had been cleaned with vinegar. The duct tape was removed and the crime scene was cleaned up. And Julie's body was posed in what's described as a provocative manner. I don't know that the word provocative is right, but Danny posed her in a way in which to humiliate her post-mortem and to cause shock when her body is found. According to the autopsy, the killer of Julie was a secretor with type B blood. And this matched Danny Rawling. So there are 8 ABO blood types. There's type A, positive, A minus, B positive, B negative, AB positive, AB negative, O positive, and O negative. The positive and negatives indicate the Rh factor, which is only present in about 15% of the population. It's not important unless you are a reproductively aged female. A secretor is someone who releases their blood antibodies into other bodily fluids, for example, semen. So the use of blood typing and secretion whether or not somebody was a secretor or not, were really early ways in which they law enforcement could determine or could rule somebody out. You can't really rule people in, but you could rule somebody out as a suspect based on this. And it's something like 80% of all people are secretors. So it's not, it's not a real definitive way in order to assess guilt, but it can be a useful tool, especially back in the late 80s before DNA technology was used the way it is today. Danny never admitted to the murders of Julie, Tom, and Sean to the police, but he did admit it to a cellmate he had later on named Bobby Lewis, but we'll talk about Bobby Lewis in another episode. At this point, Danny had not been back to church in a very long time, but that night, on November 4th, Danny showed up at his old church, and he spoke to Reverend Hudspeth, who was the reverend that married Danny and Ometha, and he asked the reverend to sit and pray with him. The reverend thought that Danny was probably high on drugs at the time because of how he was acting. By January of 1990, the Shreveport Police Department had still not been able to solve the murder of the Grissams, and so they turned to the FBI to get some help in developing a profile. And the FBI's profile of the Grissom murders was that it was done by a single white male in his late 20s to 30s, muscular and thinks of himself as a macho man, lacks remorse, although he probably did not enjoy killing the child. He probably has a record of burglaries, assaults, and sexual offenses, spent time in prison, has difficulty keeping a job, and he's confrontational and explosive. Sounds kind of like Danny Rawling, doesn't it? Join me next time as I continue to dissect the life and crimes of Danny Rawling, the Gainesville Ripper. You can follow the podcast on most of your social media platforms at SKB Pod, or you can visit the website at www.skbpod.com for more information about the show. If you're enjoying it, you can take a moment to give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast or whatever your podcast player of choice is. Thanks for joining me for this episode 3 of Danny Rawling, the Killer Cowboy Crooner.
What's your pleasure? Pass the tender with a big cigar. Give me a whiskey, 'cause I'm feeling a little risky. If that dim star's in town, well, you tell him lonely street, slinging 44s or hell they finally meet. Fast as lightning, the two world is wrong. The outlaw he was, the last thing I ever saw. one can tame. You're a rebel, no one can tame.